Welcome, everyone. We're so pleased to have everyone here with us today for our second session of Gallagher Talks. This morning's session is on trucking trends. Our speakers will be discussing supply chain risks and management of the new normal. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers this morning, Mike Thornhill, our Atlantic Area President, coming to us from Halifax today, and Joe Palmer, our Transportation Leader, also based in Atlantic Canada, coming to us from Heartland. Mike will also introduce a special guest. If you would like more information on the three speakers, feel free to click on the right of the screen and connect with them through LinkedIn. A couple of items before we get started. You'll be receiving a recording of this webinar later this week. And because of the fast-paced nature of Gallagher Talks today, any questions that come up through the sessions will be answered following the session and once it's completed. If you happen to have any technical difficulties while on the session, please use the question and answer box, and the team will be here to troubleshoot you. We hope you enjoyed today's session, and remember, if you're on LinkedIn or Twitter, please share your experience today by using hashtag Gallagher Talks. I also want to mention we have 9 more sessions after this one taking place throughout the day on areas such as real estate, fintech, and black swan events and more. So just follow the link that will pop up at the bottom of the screen at the end of this session, and will take you right to the next session. Without further ado, I'll pass it off to Mike, who will introduce our special guest and get things rolling.
Thanks very much, Tyler. As Tyler mentioned, my name is Mike Thornhill. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. It's great to have you here. I'm the area president for Atlantic Canada with Gallagher, and I've been in the insurance industry for over 20 years, split pretty much equally between both the insurer side of the business and the brokerage side of the business. I'd also like to introduce our speakers. Joe Palmer, as Tyler mentioned, Joe is our Senior Vice President of Transportation. Joe is a graduate of Acadia University. We won't hold that against him. It's okay, but we move on. Joe joined us from Palmer Atlantic and Safety Insurance, previously known as Safety Insurance, where Joe was the president and CEO of a family-owned firm primarily focused on the trucking insurance industry. And Joe joined us at Gallagher just a little bit over 2 years ago. Joe's a product of the transportation industry, has a great, rich family history, with his grandfather being a founder of a major trucking firm in Atlantic Canada, and then his father being a pioneer and founder of Safety Insurance and a pioneer in the trucking insurance and risk management industry. So thanks for joining us, Joe. Also, our special guest, we're very happy to have Colin Parsons join us. Colin is General Manager of Seafood Express Transportation based in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. And we're very happy to have our client as Colin join us today. Colin is a graduate of St. Francis Xavier University and has a unique perspective on the trucking insurance segment, given that he was a commercial insurance broker for 7 years prior to joining the trucking industry. So Colin's going to give us a great perspective from both sides of the business, but primarily focusing on that of a long-haul transportation operation. So thanks, Colin. Great to have you. Previously, in the earlier session today, Dave and Kevin kicked it off talking about the trends in the insurance industry and where we are from a market perspective. Let's kick off this presentation with Joe driving down a bit further in the trucking insurance segment and talking about what the current market conditions look like today. Joe?
Thanks, Mike. Currently, the market for long-haul trucking is very tough. We're in a very hard market. We're seeing insurers being very cautious on the risks they're writing. The specialists, the insurers that specialize in trucking insurance, are being very disciplined around rates and focused on profitability more so than growth and market share. Many of the generalists who are writing some truck insurance, we're seeing them pulling back and pulling out in some cases. And this is leading to a lot of non-renewals, more non-renewals this year than we've dealt with in the past several years. And large rate increases. We're seeing minimum increases of 10 to 15%. And then much larger depending on the carrier safety ratings and claims experience. The excess liability market is equally as difficult, perhaps even more so. We're going to touch on that a bit later. From the brokerage side, we're seeing brokers, including ourselves, requiring extensions. There's a lot more work going into the renewals. That's on the part of the brokers and the clients, and a lot more stress on everybody involved.
So Joe, that's a great job setting the stage of what the current market looks like. Maybe we can drill down a bit further and talk about some of the cost drivers and what's driving us to these current market conditions.
Well, I think we've come through a very long soft market cycle, we've been through these cycles in the past. So I think a lot of what's driven that longer soft market cycle is the fact that we had several new entrants come into the truck insurance business, keeping things very competitive and perhaps keeping rates really below sustainable levels. Equipment costs are one of the major drivers. Tractors and trailers are significantly more expensive now than they were a few years ago. And that's affecting the costs the insurers are incurring on total losses, but also with repairs. Even just small fender benders and bumper damage. With the technology and the sensors and the advancements in the equipment, a standard repair today is significantly more expensive than it was a few years ago. The U.S. exchange rate is really impacting us here in Canada. Many of our clients are crossing the border and running into the U.S. So, getting equipment fixed and having to make claims payments in U.S. dollars is also having an impact. In litigation, it continues to be an issue. Jurisdictions, not just in the U.S. but in Canada, are becoming increasingly more litigious, and we're seeing rising liability settlements and increased costs in those areas, which we're also going to touch on here in a bit.
So I'm going to turn it over to Colin now. And Colin, as General Manager of Seafood Express, I'd love to hear from a client's perspective and from an operator's perspective, what does this mean for the trucking industry? What are the things that Joe has just talked about driving the market conditions mean for the trucking industry?
First of all, thanks for having me, Mike. The biggest thing we're seeing is to protect yourself from the rising cost of insurance. To Joe's point, the cost of claims is going up significantly. We're a cross-border carrier, so the U.S. is a bit of a concerning spot with the litigious nature of the country. So the availability of insurance is also concerning. I think the biggest thing we've done 4 years ago, Joe approached us about entering a captive with some other Class A carriers. And what this helped us do is kind of lock in an insurance group that shelters us from the increasing costs of insurance and protects our premiums. You still see rate increases within the captive, but they're much lower than you see in the traditional marketplace. So I think the options are becoming very few in the traditional market. So we're very pleased with how the captive's performing, and it's helping reduce our cost of insurance. Because in the end, the rising costs of repairs, maintenance, and insurance does affect our budgets and profitability. Margins are already pretty tight within the industry, so we do what we can to kind of protect ourselves in all those areas.
Those are great comments, Colin, especially with regards to the captive, thinking outside of the box and being creative in the solutions that you use to mitigate some of these impacts to not only the industry, but to Seafood Express individually. Joe, coming back to you, what can brokers and clients do to combat these increases?
One thing which is pretty straightforward, certainly not rocket science, but starting renewals early. A lot more emphasis on getting a head start, putting together very complete and detailed submissions, being prepared for the risk services and loss control surveys the insurers do. There's a lot more emphasis being put on those than ever before. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, but putting a lot of effort and focus into being prepared for that. fostering relationships with the right insurance companies and looking at it from a long-term perspective and not just a year-by-year perspective. For clients and for trucking companies, it's really being focused on managing your claims costs and monitoring that and being focused on that and being aware of what your loss ratios are. Talking to your insurance company before you start the renewal to sit down and come up with a strategy, understand what the expectations need to be, and go into that process being prepared. And also being creative when it comes to the insurance program itself, whether it's looking at alternatives, group captives, changing your plan design, taking more risk, and things of that nature.
That's great, Joe. You know, early on in the presentation, you mentioned one of the specific areas of trucking insurance as probably taking, you know, being in a bit tougher of a situation than some of the other segments. Speaking specifically about excess liability. So what do the current market conditions look like in the excess liability segment?
It's, as I mentioned before, is probably even tougher than the primary layer. The excess liability market, in my opinion, is the toughest it's been in the last 20 years for most of us in our careers. Capacity's dried up. There's very few options, particularly fleets that have significant U.S. exposure. In those cases, the excess markets are increasing their attachment points, they're increasing minimum premiums, or they're pulling out altogether if the U.S. exposure goes beyond a certain threshold. In some cases, if there may only be one or two markets, while in other cases I've seen there are no options, and carriers are struggling to even find capacity to get their limits up to a certain level. For example, the 5x5 layer, I would say most of our clients are playing in that space and have that type of coverage. We've seen rates in that layer double or triple here over the past year, going from what was historically maybe $500 or $600 a power unit now to $1,500 to $2,000 a power unit for the 5x5 coverage.
Yeah, so, you know, exponential increases we're seeing there. One of the terms I hear bantered about in not only transportation excess liability, but excess liability as a whole is a nuclear verdict. So what's a nuclear verdict, and how does that impact excess liability within the transportation segment?
They're basically verdicts, very large liability verdicts, jury verdicts, I think by definition over $10 million, but we're seeing seven-figure verdicts becoming very common. We've even seen some headlines with verdicts being upwards of $200 million. I was actually reading a bit of a study on 600 cases that were looked at, only 4 of which back in 2006 exceeded $1 million, 4 of the 600. In 2010, that went up by about 9 times from 2010 to 2013, and it's sustained that level since then and has just become the norm. And it's not always about the facts or who's at fault. A lot of what's driving these verdicts is the pain and suffering and punishment cost. In other words, the non-economic or punitive damages, more so than just inflation. And, you know, bad injuries make bad claims, and we've seen that. And it's become a big issue for the industry.
So, Colin, coming back to you for a second from the perspective of Seafood Express, what do these nuclear verdicts mean and the impact that they have on not only increasing prices in the excess liability layers, but also a reduction in the capacity available in the excess liability layers? What does that mean for the trucking industry?
Well, thankfully, we've never been through this experience. However, this is kind of like the doomsday scenario where I think it's important to preach safety, and we focus very much on it, especially with U.S. exposure. These tend to be much more common in the U.S. Due to the nature of how claims work down there and how settlements go. So we carry the highest level of thankfully, we're able to obtain those, and it meets all of our contractual requirements. But basically, the need to focus on safety and risk management is paramount. So we do what we can to avoid these, but we see simple, minor injuries are still cost upwards of $100,000 US due to the way the claims that Canadian carriers become a target in the US because they know we carry high limits. And when they see those plates, they're coming after us for everything they can. And it's too bad that the Canadian government does a good job of legislating the insurance industry, where the U.S. Has much different standards, which is unfortunate because there's a large imbalance between the two. And I can see the Canadian insurers' concerns over that. I think that's what's driving the lack of availability of the excess liability market. So very tough one, but it really just comes down to safety and making sure that your fleet practices the best safety practices and avoid these types of situations to the best of their ability.
Those are great comments, Colin, especially with regards to the differences between the U.S. and the Canadian insurance and litigious environment. Joe, anything to add there before we move on?
Yeah, to kind of support Colin's comment, it really puts a lot more emphasis on the carrier's risk management programs. And, I have discussions with clients and sometimes they'll say, well, I do these things, but maybe I don't have them documented. Well, what's the big deal? So I don't have things documented. Well, having the practices in place is one thing. Being able to prove that you do them and have them documented makes you a lot more defendable. And when it comes to these types of cases, it's all about that. And also using technology as a way to help create defenses against these types of settlements. Dash cams obviously is a big one. An interesting statistic is in a lot of states, the plaintiff win percentage could be upwards of 90%. And obviously, we know that carriers aren't at fault or liable 90% of the time. In a lot of cases, they just don't have the defenses to protect themselves like they need to.
Those are really, I hesitate to use the word interesting stats. Scary and staggering stats is probably a better way to put it. But it leads us into the next part, which is a great segue into being an insured of choice. And what does that mean, and why does it matter, Joe?
Well, we've talked about a lot of reasons or a lot of areas that can be problematic if you don't have the proper risk management processes in place. I think today the accessibility and the cost of insurance can be the difference between trucking companies making money or not making money. They could be the difference between them staying in business or not staying in business. And they really can't afford not to be an insured of choice. Historically, underwriters have really been focused on where do you go and what do you haul? And those things are still important. But now more than ever, I'm seeing underwriters focusing on safety. They're focusing on the loss ratio, driver quality, and safety scores. And it's not just the insurance companies looking at this stuff. Shippers and our trucking clients, customers are also looking at the carrier profiles and the safety ratings that these fleets have to determine, is this the type of company I want to do business with or not?
Joe, what can clients do to become that insured of choice?
Well, working with a broker that specializes in truck insurance, working with an insurer and partnering with an insurer that specializes in truck insurance, those providers have the tools and the expertise to help improve their clients' operations and safety programs. And clients certainly trucking companies need to engage those people and buy into that. trucking companies need to foster long-term relationships with their insurance companies and look at it from a long-term perspective and not just a year-by-year perspective. Brokers need to be working with their clients and be trusted advisors and be kind of an integral part of their operation when it comes to their insurance and the risk management. And in the fleets that I see that network with their peers, that measure their performance, benchmark themselves against other companies, attend conferences, and participate in their provincial associations tend to have stronger risk management insurance programs.
Colin, given the things Joe said about what it takes to become an insurance, maybe you can talk to us about what things that Seafood Express, as a best-in-class fleet, are doing to become that insured of choice.
Well, one thing Joe mentioned is incorporating technology. We use the latest technology in the trucks with logbook, use late model equipment, and a lytic system, which is an inward-outward facing camera system that doesn't have us monitoring the drivers live, but is basically it's triggered based on driving behavior. So there's all sorts of setup for speeding, lane changes, hard braking, roll stability, things like that, that's triggered by the G-force in the truck. And those are parameters that are set up for things that we want to monitor. So if a behavior is triggered, it sends us a 10-second video for us to look at. And that way we can really do kind of over-the-road training and monitoring with drivers, and you can assess which ones are higher risk than others and try and do corrective action and be proactive with driving behavior. That's probably the biggest thing we do with technology. In addition to those things, we screen and do heavy reference checks on our drivers. So we have there's a driver shortage. I think we're going to cover that later, but it's hard to find quality drivers.
Why don't we move right into that now, Colin, and you can tell us about, I hear from clients all about driver shortages and what does that mean for companies like Seafood Express and what's causing that driver shortage?
Well, I think it's a generational change which is causing it. Nowadays, you don't find young people who want to be out on the road 5 to 7 days a week, which on one hand, I can understand. It's hard to be away from family and in a truck for that long. And another thing is that there's just a shortage within Canada for sure and the U.S. So we get drivers from all over the world. Some have never seen winter, some who can hardly speak English. So the screening and qualifying of drivers becomes very important. Some of the things that stick out, I mean, retention's big. You need to now focus on kind of driver comfort and amenities. So drivers want to be well looked after. They want to have nice new equipment that's well maintained with auxiliary power units for air conditioning in the summer and heat in the winter, where they're not idling their truck because it's hard on the trucks. So we rely heavily on immigration programs. The government's good to support us in our region to find drivers. So we're lucky where we rarely have trucks sitting empty. We're able to keep a steady pipeline of quality drivers, but we do many things like we have an extensive training program where, depending on the experience of a driver, they can spend anywhere to a week to a month in training. They usually do a minimum of a week in the classroom and then spend about a month with us on the road with a driver trainer. And then they get assigned a driver coach when they go out and do their long haul trips. So the other things are competitive wages and an efficient dispatch are important to drivers. So there's certainly more focus on the quote unquote driver and making sure that they feel like they're well supported and respected and treated very fairly.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And we certainly hear all about the driver shortage throughout the pandemic, which we'll touch on later. Obviously, if you're constantly trying to recruit new drivers, we're going to run into what underwriters call that high-risk driver. So maybe, Joe, you can talk a bit first about, what that means and what a high-risk driver is, and Colin can share his thoughts as well.
Well, we see this a lot where if a fleet was able to figure out who they are and either train them or perhaps get rid of them before they create problems, they would certainly have better claims experience. That's not always an easy thing to do. So it's really about just keeping an eye on things and monitoring things very closely and tracking trends, watching the little things, the incidents, the small incidents, even though they might not be costly, the customer service issues that a driver may have, or issues they may have with dispatch or internally, and the distractions, whether it be smoking or texting or other distractions that sometimes can be family related. And if the fleets that are tracking these small things and seeing these signs and signals can identify who those high-risk drivers are, because really it's proven that those are the people that are going to cause much bigger problems down the road.
Colin, anything to add around high-risk drivers?
Yeah, certainly you want to reduce or eliminate the high-risk drivers, but I kind of use the analogy, if you're a teacher and you have a class of children, a certain percentage is always going to be the ones that act out. And in a fleet of 50, 60, 70, 80 trucks, you're always going to have a handful of high-risk drivers. And I think the key is to stay on top of them. You need to use progressive discipline when needed, and basically reduce the liability surrounding these drivers. I think the general overall care of a driver says a lot about them. There's ones that are very focused on doing a good job, and there's other ones that are just there to either earn a paycheck or bounce around and move to different trucking companies. So it kind of comes down to the recruiting and HR side of the business. It's certainly a huge component to hiring new drivers, and the better job you do qualifying and screening them certainly helps reduce the amount of high-risk drivers that you have in the fleet.
That's a great strategy and great comments, Colin. So just before we leave the driver topic, what does it mean to your business to have those high-quality drivers?
Well, a couple things. They certainly help profitability. A professional driver is very efficient out on the road. They focus on maintaining their truck, providing good customer service. Your drivers are your face when they're out in front of your customers. Taking care of the equipment and protecting your safety score. Something we haven't talked a lot about is outside of insurance, the U.S. and Canadian governments track the safety scores of carriers. And I think this is very important because the public deserves safe roads to be on, and it's up to the carriers to make sure that they can maintain a high level of safety. That's kind of their due care that they owe. And a lot of the large grocers and other large shippers out there rely heavily on these safety scores to gauge which carriers they'll work with. So in the end, it can really affect the volume of freight you haul and who you haul for. So it really affects the business overall. So the quality of the driver is extremely important.
Yeah, no, great comments, Colin. And, much like all businesses, it's the people that make the business. The technology supplements it, but it's really coming down to the quality of the people that we have. Moving on a bit, but not completely leaving the topic of drivers. How, Colin, has the pandemic affected driver availability? How has COVID-19 impacted the ability to find those high-quality drivers?
Well, at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw a lot of concerns with drivers reporting to work. Everyone was very concerned about traveling to the U.S. That's where we frequent, and rightfully so. Some of them decided not to work, and we were supportive of that at the time because we wanted to respect their kind of rights and their health and their families. So it was a challenge at first, and The funny thing it did, though, was improve retention, because no one really wanted to move anywhere or do anything. So we saw a lot of them stick around. But then as time went on, things opened up a bit. And although retention stayed high, it did make it more challenging bringing drivers into the company, because it was hard to travel between provinces. Here in Atlantic Canada, we were in a bubble. Eventually they could get kind of travel passes to come here. They had to isolate and do things. So it's certainly adding a new element to it. It's a bit more challenging, but things have opened up a bit and become slightly less challenging than they originally were.
So still staying with COVID-19 and the pandemic implications, what have you seen in terms of impact on freight rates, Colin?
We haven't seen a large impact on rates. Certainly still very competitive out there between carriers. We've seen more of a dramatic change in freight volumes. We ran a lot more empty miles during the height of the pandemic. There was less products being shipped. It affected more of the dry business than the reefer business. We're in the reefer business, so we were kind of lucky. We haul mainly food products, and food still needed to get to grocery stores. It just meant we had some higher costs in terms of running some more empty miles, and volumes were down. So that's slowly catching up, and we're seeing an improvement heading into the fall. So we're thankful to be through the kind of the height of the pandemic and put that behind us, because it led to probably our most challenging year in the history of the company. So hopefully the second waves they talk about, things don't shut down quite like they did. But we're also very thankful to be considered an essential service and be able to continue doing business the way we have.
Yeah, I know, aside from insurance, as consumers, we're all thankful for everything that truckers did throughout the pandemic to keep goods moving, both within the province, within the country, and across the border. So thanks to you and your team for that, Colin.
Thank you.
Joe, COVID-19 again, have we seen it yet impact lost experiences?
I don't know if I've seen it really impact loss experience. I think maybe it could be a little early to tell if there's going to be an impact on loss experience going forward. I would say I've kind of a few observations when it comes to that. I think during the peak of the pandemic, when things were shut down, and people were home, there's certainly a lot less traffic on the roads. I think that made things easier for our clients. And you could perhaps argue that there were less motor vehicle accidents as a result of that. I don't think it's had a material impact on the industry from a claim standpoint. I think companies that were hauling products that weren't essential, who got into hauling things that they were less familiar with, such as, let's say, a flatbed company who decided to go out and get a few reefer trailers, or companies that just hauled freight that they weren't as experienced with when it comes to securement and handling, arguably could have seen more claims there. And probably the third observation is the companies that were impacted a little bit more, that had to cut back on staff and perhaps took their eye off the ball a little bit from a safety standpoint. That potentially could lead to some deterioration in loss experience. But I would say in general, we haven't seen a major impact.
So Joe, just to close things out here as we're nearing the end of our time, I'm going to get you to look into your crystal ball and give us a bit of your outlook on what the forecast for 2021 is going to look like.
Well, as Colin mentioned and you mentioned, I think we're all fortunate to be working with the transportation industry, and they're an essential service, and certainly proud to be involved with that industry. It's interesting. I was reading about one of the larger U.S. LTL carriers who saw their revenues were down about 20% in April, 15% in May, 6% in June, and then in July it was back to what it was the year before. And I would say that's kind of what I've seen with a lot of our clients is currently everybody's back up to about where they were before the pandemic. started. And, you know, we're hoping to see that continue. So, you know, I guess the question mark is that we all have, and I don't know that anybody has an answer for this yet, is the second wave, what impact, if and when that will happen, and what impact that will have on the business, whether we'll see kind of an economic shutdown like we did when this first started, and whether that will impact our clients again. Will it be as bad? Will it be worse? Will there be drivers that have concerns, and will that create some issues? So I would say it's yet to be seen, but from what we're seeing currently, the transportation industry is back on its feet, and hopefully that continues.
Hey, Joe, thanks for wrapping things up there. We really appreciate it. Sounds like Mike had some technical difficulties and his computer died on him. So I decided to slip in here and fill in the blanks and post things up for you guys. So really appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, no problem. It was great, great session overall, guys. And I know that the trucking industry has seen a lot of flux over the last, 6 to 8 months. And some of the information you provided was definitely valuable. And it was absolutely interesting to hear the technology and the different tools that you're using to mitigate risk. So great talk and really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Joe. Have a great day.